That's Stacey Blackwood. I'm Clint Lamb, and this is Strength and Conditioning. First of all, Stacey, not a big fan of this orange theme that we got going this week. It's a very cool background overlay, whatever you want to call it. But this week, I don't know if I'm feeling the orange, but we moved past it. It's 1 week. We can get through it, right, man? So it's been a while since we've talked, and I kind of just want to get your take as we kind of move into this Tennessee game. Where are you at as far as this team, man? I mean, you had the Georgia game, then you had the Vandy loss, then you had the South Carolina struggle. What are your thoughts on Alabama currently? I mean, I guess 5-1. We're at the midway point of the regular season.
Man, that's a difficult question because who knows really? I mean, this team has been Jekyll and Hyde, I guess. I mean, you look at what happened in the early, the first half of the Georgia game, where they looked like the most dominant team in college football. But ever since then, they look pretty pedestrian. I mean, the offense, for the most part, has still been playing, relatively good. I think they're good enough to keep you in every game. The defense, on the other hand, it's just been a lot of, whether it's mistakes, just not being able to get off the field on third down or fourth down. Just a series of unfortunate events for the defense, really. And some of it has been self-inflicted. Some of it has been, the other team just making plays, which you got to tip your hat to those guys. But I'm not sure what to make of this team. I think they have I think I put it on the message board. They have all the ingredients to be one of the elite teams in college football. They're just not playing like it right now. So, but the good news is there's still a whole half of a season to play. And, they can turn it around starting this week against Tennessee, who's a good team. But you could also make the case that they're not really playing it up to what, I'm sure their fans wish they were doing. So it's kind of an interesting matchup as we head into this week against Tennessee, because I think both teams are kind of in the same boat as far as not living up to the expectations that maybe not only their fans, but even I think the players and the coaches have for their each team.
Well, is it strange to you how preseason everybody said Nick Saban's gone? So much of this roster has been turned over, just an unbelievable amount. And I went over yesterday, I mean, just hammering all the different positions, all the different losses, coaching staff changes, all those different things. And obviously, primarily, it's losing Nick Saban. But, there's a reason that Alabama came in preseason, I think number 7, if I'm not mistaken, right?
All right.
So what are they now?
7.
So, is it not kind of strange to you how it's kind of, in some ways, there has been a, seemingly some drop off. Now, is that a permanent drop off? Is that the Nick Saban factor? Is this here to stay, or is that the fact that there is so much turnover? It's difficult to kind of get, get guys transition to how you approach things. I mean, even guys like, the Malachi Moore situation, against Vanderbilt, where, I mean, he's still trying to get used to how his coach is even going to handle that, right? I mean, Nick Saban, and I don't want to keep bringing up Nick Saban and making the comparisons, but it's obvious that Nick Saban would have handled that differently. What would he have done? I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate. But I think we can all agree he would have handled that situation different, especially in the moment. So it's like, I mean, you're trying to get used to that. I mean, you're trying to get used to, being able to keep your eyes on the quarterback from that vision-oriented defense. You're trying all these new, different things. And, I mean, you're halfway through the season. I'm sure some people want some of this stuff to start getting figured out. But is it overly shocking that it's not been completely figured out at this point?
No, I don't think so. I think a lot of what the concern comes from is how it's all happened, because you come in Georgia and look, I mean, basically unbeatable in the first quarter. I mean, you look like a team that if you lined up against anybody else in college football, that they don't have a shot. And then the past, 12 quarters now, they have just looked, I mean, lost in a lot of ways. And that's not just defensively. There's been a lot of situations where offensively they haven't looked their best. So I think it's not so much what's happened, but more of how it's happened, and maybe the way everything's went down from the second half of Georgia, through the South Carolina game. So maybe not surprised where they sit right now at 5-1, halfway through the season. ranked number 7. So you're still ranked inside the top 10, basically where everybody thought you would be at this point in the season. But it's just kind of how things have shaped up so far. And so I guess fans shouldn't be surprised that there is some transition going on. I mean, I think that's obvious, like you mentioned. That's going to happen. You lose the greatest coach of all time. You lose a lot of talent, a completely new offensive scheme, a completely new defensive scheme. Of course, there's going to be bumps along the way. There's going to be bumps in the road. You're going to go through some growing pains as you transition into this new era of Alabama football. But I think it's more of how it's all happened, as far as the way you losing to Vandy, the way you look in the second half against Georgia, and the way you look, for pieces of that South Carolina game is what's kind of, I guess, frustrated the fans the most.
Do you think the first half of the Georgia game kind of, in some ways, screwed up the perception? Meaning, okay, I've always heard this thing like turn your expectations into appreciations. That's a big like Tony Robbins thing. I don't know if anybody's a Tony Robbins fan. I certainly am. But he kind of made he has made the comparison, and I don't remember the exact story and how it lays out, so I'm probably going to butcher this. But as far as like international Wi-Fi on planes, like that had never been done before, and like when it was finally first done, everybody's like, "Wow, this is incredible!" Like you don't have to, twiddle your thumbs for 17 straight hours as you're going, overseas. And then very quickly it went back down, like to where they couldn't make it work like they thought they could, and everybody lost it. It was only available for maybe like, I don't know, maybe a few weeks, if even that. And yet, just in that amount of time, people had come to expect that when they take international flights, when it had never been done before. And so, they weren't mad before when it had never been done. But as soon as you see it and you have that, and then it gets taken away from you, that's when you lose your mind. Now you're ticked off about something that you wouldn't have been pissed off about, previously. Is it kind of a similar situation with Alabama in what you saw in the first half? The fact that Alabama fans for that half, they felt like nothing's changing from Nick Saban. He's come in, he's figured it out. We've got 20 more years of this, of being the program and not having issues. And then the second half happens, and then you're still really excited about the first, and then you get Vandy loss, and then you get South Carolina struggles, and everybody's like, I've seen it. I know they're capable of it. Why can't we have that? Do you think that's actually hurting their perception in some ways?
I haven't thought about that until you mentioned it. And I mean, I think that is certainly playing a factor into all this, because they did look. I don't even the way they play. That was probably the best quarter of football that I've seen a team play. Maybe even ever. I don't. It's hard to say that, but I mean,
given the team and the talent,
yes,
yes, absolutely, I agree with you.
So I think that now that you mentioned that, that certainly has to play a factor into everybody's, even if it's subconscious. I mean, you just have that in your mind of, hey, this is what this team can look like and has looked like at least for one quarter. So yeah, I mean, I think if you come out and play the way you did against in the second half of that game, and then against Vanderbilt and against South Carolina, then yeah, I certainly think that's playing a role in how how fans are perceiving this team, and what their expectations are moving forward. So, but I'll say this, and I think people have been pointing it out lately. If you go back and look last season under DeBoer at Washington, there was a lot of close games. I don't know if you were going to bring that up or not, but if you go back and look at that schedule, there was very few blowouts, even against teams they were better than. And you look at that offense they had last year with Penix and Odunze and all the McMillan, whatever, all the guys they had there on that offensive side of the ball. I mean, they were just loaded. There's still a lot of top football games. Maybe it's just kind of how it is. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if Alabama fans are ready for that or not after what they experienced with Nick Saban. But I do think that first half, and more specifically that first quarter against Georgia, has maybe made those expectations more than what they probably should have been.
And that's an excellent point about DeBoer and just what he kind of was at Washington. We focus on the win-loss total, right? But sometimes you lose context on how some of those games actually went, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, if I were to tell you right now, Alabama is going to win every single game remaining on their schedule by 2 points, and they're going to go into the college football playoff, they're going to go into the SEC championship. win by 2 points. College football playoff, they're winning a national championship and they win every single game by 2. Is an Alabama fan going to care? No. You might lose about half your fan base through heart attacks between now and then, but they would take that all day. That's wins, that's national championships. And so I think because Nick Saban made it for a very long time, not in recent years, but for a very long time, Nick Saban made it look easy. And that is why a lot of people, I mean, we act like when Alabama didn't lose to Texas by double-digit points at Bryant-Denny Stadium, which in hindsight is a very respectable loss. That was a playoff team. I mean, people, and you've always had kind of the crazies, quote unquote, where they're like, man, Alabama loses one game. I think the game's passed Nick Saban by. I think he needs to step away, even as he was declining as far as what he could get done. I don't think it was necessarily a Nick Saban decline. I think it was the landscape of college football completely changing. And it's not even really something that Nick Saban could adapt to. Like, he was adapting to everything that he could, but just with the way that the sport was operating, he was going to make it to where he would never be able to do some of the things that he was able to do early in his career. And so people have seen domination. They've seen games, and when it's happening, you kind of it's nice kicking the mess out of somebody every once in a while. As a fan, especially from an anxiety standpoint, a lot of people will tell you, I want that every week, murder everybody. But, that Georgia game and the way it was fun for that first half now, I think we were all having a blast. I mean, I was blown away, was really having a hard time even watching the game. I couldn't wrap my mind around what was happening. But then you get that second half, one of the most fun atmospheres I've ever seen in college football. One of them, probably wouldn't put it at number one, but it's as close as I've ever come besides that top spot for me. And, Alabama still ends up winning the game. So, it's going to look different. If you got high blood pressure, you need to make sure that your prescriptions are filled, on a regular basis, because you're going to need them watching, these Alabama teams now. But from an excitement standpoint, in hindsight, that Georgia game was a lot of fun. I mean, and it was a lot to talk about. This Tennessee game, we're expecting it to be close. I mean, and people are going to have anxiety going into the game. They're unsure if Alabama's going to win. But that when you do win, when you weren't sure, you appreciate it that much more, and that's the bottom line.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Just win. I mean, that's the name of the game, especially in this modern era of college football. And you kind of brought it up. I mean, even we quickly forget even things that happened last year. Arkansas was a terrible football team last year. What happened to win that game by at home? What, 24-21? I mean, it was like a 3-point game or something. Yeah. I mean, so we shouldn't act like this is something new. Now, I'm not trying to compare this year's team to last year's team or DeBoer to Saban, but it's just context is important, and it's not like this is the first time something like this has happened. So it's just the nature of the beast. College football is totally different now, but the problem is an entire generation of Alabama fans grew up with Nick Saban dominating college football, and so they just have that expectation. And I'm not blaming them; it's not their fault. It's just the era they grew up in, and if they expect Alabama to win by 30 every game, I mean that's what they expect, and they're going to be disappointed because I'm afraid. I'm not saying it's not going to happen from time to time, but that consistently dominating your opponent week in and week out, I just think that era of college football is gone with the transfer portal, with NIL. The landscape of college football is totally different. So now I think it's that mindset, like you mentioned, you just got to come out with a win. I mean, and the Georgia game is a great example. If you told Alabama fans before that game started, hey, you're going to win this game 41-34, they wouldn't care how it happened. They wouldn't care.
Yes.
So I just think if fans will just look at it from that perspective, you'll feel a lot better. That blood pressure won't get quite as high. And but I'm with you, Clint. You just got to come out with a win, regardless of how it happens. And despite that loss to Vandy, everything Alabama wants is still ahead of them. The beauty of college football right now is they win out, they're in. They can probably even afford to lose another game, and they're still in the college football playoffs. So, but this week against Tennessee is a good opportunity to kind of clean the things up, because despite the landscape of college football being different, more parity now than ever, Alabama has not lived up to what they can do. They're not playing their best football. There's no doubt about that. That's just because you're winning doesn't mean you're doing enough. And Alabama's not doing enough. They can be better defensively. I think they can be better offensively as far as not turning the football over. That's really my only critique of the offense outside of the production at running back is turning the football. I think 5 turnovers in the last 2 games. I
Three
think
games.
3 games. Oh yeah, 3 games. You can't have that. So, but this Tennessee game is a really good opportunity to kind of start taking steps in the right direction.
I also don't think people understand there's this new element that we've never seen need to be dealt with in college football. And that is, we saw it in the 14 playoff, obviously. Alabama plays Georgia in the SEC championship, and then they play them again. Oregon plays Washington last year in the regular season. They play them again in the Pac-12 championship. You always got that a little bit, but your chances of having to see a team again and potentially even a third time now is higher than ever. So when you're playing Georgia and it's the second half and you've got such a commanding lead, it's like we've got to play them a second time more than likely if we want to, get where we're going, and maybe even a third time. Why do you think Les Miles was complaining about having a rematch against Alabama back in 2011? I think he believed in his team to be able to, it was at least comparable. He might think Alabama's as good as them. I mean, that first game kind of proved it. It was pretty even, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't like the fact that you were going to have to play that same team again. Beating a team twice is tough. And so there is this juggling act that you're trying to do now, or at least you have to keep, it's got to be on your mind, where it's like, okay, you might play Tennessee this weekend, and then you might play them again in the college football playoff at some point. You play LSU, you might play them again. You play Georgia, you might play them again. So it's this difficult. It's you've got to win, and I think that's what's getting lost sometimes on this coaching staff is you might be trying to go into some of these games not doing a whole lot, not revealing a whole lot, but that can cause you to lose. Bottom line. So, and they learned that about as tough of a lesson as you can learn on that front. But at the same time, I can see where it would be difficult. I'm not trying to make excuses for anybody, but just when has this been such a commonplace in college football? It never really has, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point because Georgia obviously made adjustments in that second half. It's easy to go back to that Georgia game because I think this kind of encapsulates everything that's went on this season for Alabama. So Georgia makes adjustments in the second half. And like you mentioned, Alabama's got that big lead. Do they really need to counter those adjustments too much in case they see Georgia again? And then Georgia knows what their counter, reaction is to that. So I'm with you. I think that there's so many different, I don't know, the way college football is now is so different than what most of us grew up with, and it's changed so quickly that it's hard to kind of understand all the nuances of what's going on in a coach's mind, leading up to a game, during a game, and how they try to navigate a week by week basis of, hey, there's a possibility, we got to play Tennessee again. So, what do we do if this happens? What do we do if we get up big? What do we do if we get down by a lot? So there's just so many different, things. And like you mentioned, this is not an excuse for the coaching staff because they got to win. I mean, that's their number one job is to win. But their goal is to win a championship. So that how they navigate that has become a lot more difficult, even with an expanded playoff, because like you mentioned, you might be seeing these guys again, and that changes everything.
It does, yeah. And so now we'll kind of move into more of the specific Alabama Tennessee talk. It's interesting because Tennessee, you've already mentioned they've been dealing with their own struggles, and it's kind of odd how much. Not from how it's looked necessarily, but how things like you look at Tennessee. At one point, everybody thought Tennessee was the best team in the country, and they, really hadn't had to play anybody to prove that. Now, granted, that the difference is Alabama did have to play somebody after that Georgia game. Everybody said they're the best team in the country, even though there were still doubters, and some people were even saying, I actually am coming out of this game thinking Georgia is still the better team. So, I mean, it wasn't like it was universal, but it also wasn't universal with Tennessee either. But, so that's the highs. And then Alabama loses to Vanderbilt. Tennessee loses to Arkansas. Alabama struggles against South Carolina. Tennessee struggles against Florida. Two very, subpar SEC teams. And so now, it's interesting to me how many Bama fans this week have kind of taken this approach of Alabama's going to get the mess kicked out of them by Tennessee. Their offense is going to be able to pretty much score at will. And it's like, I don't know if you've been watching their offense, but it's a good offense. It's got a lot of talent. And at any moment, it can break out. And you got to believe in Josh Heupel's ability to game plan and
Mhm.
scheme for a game like this. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if maybe they had been holding some things back. That's kind of caused some of the things that we've seen with them, especially against Florida. I understand it's a rivalry game. You don't want to approach it that way, but I can. Part of me thinks Alabama did that to an extent with with Georgia and Auburn last year. The fact they struggled in the Iron Bowl, it's the Iron Bowl. You got to win that. But I will say, when you've got big bad Georgia, who everybody thinks is going to beat you, kind of like in that 2021 SEC championship, Nick Saban was never really the look ahead type. But I'm saying from a player's perspective, Auburn wasn't that
Mhm.
great last year, finished sub 500. So, that is possible. But when you look at Tennessee, I mean, you love the scheme. I still very much believe in Heupel's scheme. I
Yeah.
don't think that's really the problem. But from an execution standpoint, they're dealing with their own struggles, just like Alabama is really on the defensive side of the football. And then Tennessee's defense has been really, really good and has continued to be good. I would say right now, if you're talking about offense, defense for both teams, I would say the most consistent has probably been Tennessee's defense, right?
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's actually mirrored each other pretty remarkably.
Yeah, and to touch on, you talked about Tennessee holding back some things offensively. I think one thing they're probably holding back is more design runs for Nico. He has not ran the ball a lot, and you're talking about a guy that's 6'6", and he's not a physical runner. He's not gonna break a bunch of tackles, but when you're 6'6" and you have those long strides, 4 or 5 yards, a couple different times a drive is a game changer. So that might be something that to look out for this weekend. When I watch Tennessee, I feel like if they had a little bit more from Nico in that department, they could be a little bit better offensively because he's still growing as a passer and reading defenses and going through his progressions because he's still such a young player. They've struggled at tackle because of injury, so he hadn't had a lot of time back there either. That's led to some of their issues on offense. But you know that they're going to try to run the football. And so I think that's the strength, maybe the biggest strength between these two teams is Tennessee's ability to run the football. I think that is with Dylan Sampson. That dude is good. I mean, that he is a tackle breaking machine. He is gonna eat you up. And if Alabama does not contain him in this game, it's going to be a long day for them because that's going to allow Nico and those talented receivers to make plays that way. But I do. It's crazy how these two teams do mirror each other. Under Josh Heupel, Tennessee has been a dominant offensive team. The last few years, Alabama has been a really good defensive team, and now this year, Tennessee's struggling offensively, but is dominant on defense. And Alabama is struggling on defense, and they're finding their way under this new offensive system with Jalen Milroe at quarterback, and they're outplaying the Alabama defense. So it's just such a crazy, I guess, matchup as far as how these two teams are kind of coming in this matchup differently than they do in most years. So I'm looking forward to that. I think this game is a great measuring stick for both teams and where they're at in this season. Tennessee is at home. That part does help them, but this is going to be a fun matchup on Saturday afternoon because I think both these coaches live for the big games. I really do. I think if you look at what Heupel does in his big time matchups, getting the upset over Alabama a couple of years ago, I think if you look at DeBoer's track record in big games, whether it's against now Kirby Smart, against Steve Sarkisian, against Dan Lanning, he has a really good track record in those big games. So I think both these head coaches, both these teams are coming into this game with something to prove, and I think that's going to make this matchup even more exciting.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And Dylan Sampson is certainly a guy. I mean, I think he's closing in. Yeah, he's got to think about close to 700 yards rushing in 6 games.
Yeah.
He's only had one game where he didn't break 100 yards, and it was against Oklahoma. He had 92. He's rushed for 15 touchdowns, which is leading the SEC. I think Jalen Milroe sitting there at second with 11.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's by a pretty wide margin. He has been their run game,
Mhm.
period. We talk about the Tennessee run game. We might as well say Dylan Sampson because that has
Yeah.
been the biggest part of it. And with Nico, I agree with you. And when you approach these games, what happens is how many times do we hear Nick Saban, especially in recent years, but really it's always been this way. This is how football operates. But, you hear Kane Womack talk about some of the defensive performances, especially against Vandy and against South Carolina, where they say, we didn't really see that coming. That they hadn't really put that on tape. Kirby Smart talked about that a lot at halftime when Alabama was up 30-7. They were doing things like when they were sending or motioning out the running back to go empty. A lot of times they're running the football or they're throwing shot plays. In that particular game, they were taking more of the short to intermediate stuff off of those, motioning to empty. And Kirby was like, we hadn't really seen that on tape from them. So they had a tough time adjusting. So it's all about, I can talk about, first of all, Tennessee is a 60-40 split. They are predominantly an inside run team. Now it is 60-40, so you're still going to see some outside run, but 60% inside run is way above average. I don't think people realize. So they want to run between the tackles, and they're going to try to do that. They're a good enough team where they're not going to let Alabama necessarily dictate what they do. They're going to try to win their way if they can. But because Alabama sees that, Alabama's probably going to have a game plan ready to say, let's force not only slow down their interior run game, but their run game in general. Let's put it on Nico's shoulders and see what he does. And so Tennessee's going to try to be ahead of that and already have that countered. And I think you raise a great point. Even Tyler Van Dyke, in the very short period he was in there for Wisconsin, he's not really a runner, right? But he's doing some zone read and catching Alabama off the backside where they're not really expecting it. And it was a good way to pick up some yardage. That's something that Wisconsin wasn't going to do a ton, but Nico can easily do that kind of stuff. And that might be, those types of things might be some wrinkles that Alabama might not be anticipating. But if you do the Nico scouting report, you've got to understand this guy can move. He's a dual threat quarterback. He's not a volume runner. I don't think he's got the frame where he's going to take a beating and hold up extremely well, but he can make you pay. He's got some wheels and he's pretty athletic. And so that's an element that I wouldn't be shocked if Tennessee kind of ran with that a little bit.
Yeah, that's what made me think of that, is the fact that they're so inside run heavy that Alabama is going to be that's they're going to be their defensive game plan. Hey, we can't allow them on first and second down to pick up 3 and 4 yards, setting up a 3rd and 2. So we've got to be able to stop their inside run game, and I think that's going to open up opportunities for Tennessee, possibly to exploit Alabama with some QB runs to the outside or some zone reads where he keeps it when Alabama's crashing down. So that part is going to be fun to watch because Nico is athletic enough. But I'm with you. It would be the only thing that I'm sure Tennessee is a little hesitant of. He's thin. I mean, I don't know what he weighs, but it ain't much. And you can't take beatings in the SEC, unless you're built like Jalen Milroe. I mean, he can run it 15 to 20 times a game because he's 225, 230, but looks like a linebacker. So it's just different. So I'm not sure Nico can do that, but all it takes is 4 to 6 of them in a game where maybe it's important 3rd downs that they pick up, which is something Alabama has struggled with as of late, and it's because of the legs of Nico. So I think that's certainly something Alabama is going to have to, maybe adjust to once the game gets here. And that's certainly something I'll be watching out for as Saturday rolls around, because the passing game, I'm sure they're going to do their best. Tennessee's going to find ways. I mean, that's just Heupel. I mean, I have all the confidence that Josh Heupel's going to figure out ways to get Nico going. I'm with you. I think they've probably been holding back a little bit against Arkansas in Florida because, I know they lost to Arkansas, like Alabama lost to Vanderbilt, but most of the time, especially this year, a C+ performance from Tennessee is going to beat those top teams because they're just not up to their level. So I think they kind of held back a little bit. Nico has been turning the football over a little bit as well. I think a lot of that, like I mentioned, has to do with the amount of pressure that he has been under because their injury issues at tackle, which is something this Alabama defense has to exploit this weekend. I know Tennessee will try to get the football out early. I know they're going to try to run the football at the middle to kind of get Alabama from just firing off the edge for them. But I think a pass rush from Alabama this weekend is really important because they have to make Nico uncomfortable in this game. And I know he's a kind of a moxie kid, but I think if they can get pressure on Nico, then that could be a game changer for this defense.
It absolutely can. Yeah. And, for Alabama fans wanting to understand what's going on with Tennessee's offense, in the last couple of games, I would probably compare it to, if to anything, it would be like the South Florida game for Alabama's offense, where penalties and negative plays were crushing drives. They're kind of shooting themselves in the foot quite a bit.
Especially early
Yes.
in that first half against Florida. That was awful.
Yes, and so, like, you wonder, a lot of people are, like, concerned, not Alabama fans, they don't care if the scheme works or not, but really, like, Tennessee fans, they're concerned about scheme at this point. I mean, how do you have Josh Heupel, one of the best offensive minds in college football, and you're putting up 14 points and 17 points and all this, and it's like, I mean, you're shooting yourselves in the foot. I mean,
Yeah.
Alabama's offense, it took a late game surge with 4 touchdowns in, like, the last, 8 minutes of the game or
6 or 8
something
minutes, yeah.
crazy. So, I mean, it took something like that for that to look a lot more respectable. Before that, it was 14-13, I believe,
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that. So, I mean, it can happen to really anybody. You can't have self-inflicted wounds. That makes you feel good if you're Alabama, because you're hoping that continues, because they can help out your defense. Your defense that's struggling, if they start doing some of that, you don't have to do as much. But at the same time, one thing I did want to talk about and bring up is, in your mind, what would you say is the toughest environment that Jalen Milroe's played in? And I mean, if
Wow.
I'm honestly, it's just something
Maybe,
that I really thought about.
man,
Kyle Field last year,
maybe, yeah, that or
Jordan
at
Hare.
Auburn. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, hadn't
I
really
mean,
been too tough of situations on the road, really. I
yeah. I
mean,
mean,
those are 2 great environments, don't get me wrong, but
but
it's
Auburn
not
was
gonna be.
terrible last
Yeah,
year.
yeah, as far as, level of opponent and level of stadium atmosphere, this is probably gonna be the toughest environment Milroe's been in that I
I
can
would
recall.
I would say so too. Yeah, I mean, and I remember everybody panicking a couple of years ago when, is Bryce Young going to be healthy enough to play in this Tennessee game? Because Jalen Milroe the week before, I think it was the week before,
Yeah,
it had really struggled against Texas A&M, and now you're like, you going to Neyland Stadium? Well, now he's going to, and now he's a completely different player, especially from then, but even from last year, he's
right,
grown. I'm not saying, oh, he's in big trouble. But we kind of talked about it with Carson Beck going into Tuscaloosa. It's like, I
yep,
mean, this cat, I mean, how many really, really tough environments has this guy played in?
yeah,
And that first half, he was not ready for it. And
right,
so, with the way that Jalen Milroe kind of, and I've said this multiple times, I said this earlier today with Mick, some of those turnovers, just not great decisions. I don't think you should have been pressing at the end of the first half. I think you need to understand your opponent, that it was not Wisconsin's defensive line. That was a much different approach. You needed to, situational awareness. You didn't need to do that, but it was still a poor decision from Jalen Milroe. You don't need to
mhm,
do that. But you talk about the strip sack against Vanderbilt. That wasn't really on him, in my opinion.
right,
I think that the Georgia interception down to the goal line, that wasn't really on him. It was a little bit behind him, but with where the defender was, I mean, I get it. That's where you wanted to put it, and it just so happens that the tight end swings around and it kind of bounces off of him. And then I still think that the Vanderbilt, it was a late throw on the pick six, but I don't think that results in a pick six or even an interception 9 times out of 10.
right,
It just so happened to bounce up like it did and made it really easy for them. So, some of that stuff is not necessarily on him, or it's fluky where you can't really blame him.
right.
I never blamed Mac Jones for the, interception against Auburn, the fluky one off of
Yeah,
Najee Harris. Like, people will say, oh, he threw 2 pick sixes in that game. You need to start saying one, because really
yeah,
one of them is just, you can't blame him for that. It's
no,
the same way with some of this stuff. And it's not even, some of this stuff's not as nearly as fluky as that. But I will say, I don't think it's that he's playing as poorly as 5 turnovers in 3 games would indicate. But he is turning the football over. Some of
right,
it is
yeah,
not great decisions. Taking the safety or trying to throw the ball away at the last second and getting a safety, that can't happen. And when you start talking about this environment against this defense, I don't think we've ever seen Jalen Milroe have to play this combination of factors. And that's something else to keep in mind when you're trying to, whether it's just trying to decide who you're going to bet on, who you're going to, how you think it's going to play out. This needs to be something that we're talking about a little bit more, because, we're going to find out a lot about Jalen Milroe and how much he's grown. I think that he has. I think he's fully capable of rising to the occasion, but it is something that you at least got to mention.
yeah, I agree 100%, and I really hadn't thought about that till you asked the question, about tough environments for Milroe, and it's certainly gonna be a It's going to be totally different than what he experienced at Kyle Field, totally different than what he experienced at Jordan Hare last year. So I think it is the most difficult. And Milroe has, despite I would say half the turnovers this year that he's had, been kind of fluky. If we're being honest, like you said, they're still turnovers, and they still count as turnovers. And the other team gets the ball, and it takes the ball away from your team, no matter how it happens. So you got to protect the football on the road. I mean, I think the biggest key for this Alabama offense this week is 2 years ago. What was a killer for this team in Knoxville? Penalties. Was it 17? Is that
Yeah,
what
15, 17,
15?
something crazy. No, it
Just
was something like that. You might be right with 17. It was crazy.
it was astronomical. You can't. I don't care who you play. If you commit, let's just say 15 plus penalties on the road, you're not going to win. I don't care who you are. So you have to take care of the things that you can take care of. You got to play smart if you're Milroe. I'm with you. I think he has matured so much. I think he has grown so much as a player. I think DeBoer and Sheridan have done a fantastic job with him and kind of building his confidence and showing, or not showing, but kind of showing is the best way to put it. Like what he does best. I can't think of what I'm trying
Highlighting.
to think. Highlighting what he does best. Yeah, there you go. As far as putting him in running game, helping him make decisions quicker. And I know that's easy to say, but I didn't feel like last year's staff done that. I felt like there was so many deep shots, didn't really get him comfortable in the running game. And it just kind of felt like he was just out there. Hey, it's either going to be taking a shot down the field or we're going to hand it to Jace, and that's the offense. So I feel like they're kind of open things up for Milroe. They've given him more confidence. He's obviously grown as a player. He understands defenses better than I think he did last year, which comes with age and comes with experience. But he's certainly going to have to navigate a tough environment this weekend, and he's going to have to be in control of this offense if Alabama wants to be at their best against a really good Tennessee defense.
Yeah, and I will say, just going to Kyle Field, that was not a great Texas A&M team. Obviously, Jimbo Fisher got fired,
Yeah.
but defensively, especially their defensive front, they were really, really good. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in Alabama had lost Darian Dalcourt and Terrence Ferguson wasn't available. And so who ended up stepping up? It was Jaden Roberts. And everybody was like, man, third string right guard against this defensive front. Jalen Milroe kind of been struggling. This is not a recipe, good recipe. But what happened? Alabama's defense, I don't think we talk about enough. Like Jalen Milroe goes out there and throws an interception against Texas A&M. Alabama's defense goes out there and gets in the football right back. And I think that kind of thing was so big for him. He's going to need some help on that front in this game. You've got to take some pressure off of him. You got to generate some turnovers. Nico is not above him. I mean, we talked about it. He's been kind of struggling with that too. He gets the home crowd at his back, which is great. But what I
Right.
will say is for Alabama's defense, and I mentioned this on the show earlier, it was the offense that got the easy job when the game's in Tuscaloosa against Georgia. The
Mm-hmm.
defense, because Neyland Stadium's not going to be loud when Alabama's defense is out there because it's their offense. So they should be able to communicate. It should be really simple against Georgia. I mean, Georgia's offense is struggling to figure out what they're doing, but the defense is trying to do all that stuff too. So you should be at an advantage relative. I mean, obviously Tennessee's offense isn't dealing with the crowd noise in that moment too, but from a defensive perspective, you should have no issues with communication.
Right. Yeah.
They are going to run tempo, and that's going to be a problem. But you've got to be able to help out Jalen Milroe in whatever ways that you can, because I wouldn't be shocked if he had at least one turnover or maybe even two turnovers. And they could be bad, real bad turnovers. They could be fluky, just, Tennessee playing great football, atmosphere gets to them. Maybe they start stalling out. It's a very boomer bust offense. So there's
Yes.
going to be some 3 and out. So you've got to erase some of Tennessee's possessions, or as many as you possibly can. I think they're probably, with the way they're playing right now, they're going to shoot themselves in the foot too. And they're going to give the ball right back to you, going 3 and out and stuff like that. But I think that the difference will be made in the ones that can eliminate obviously as many
Yeah.
possessions as you possibly can. And so if you could do that through turnovers, with Tennessee also shooting themselves in the foot, cancel out, any problems you might have. And you cannot have a Quandarius Robinson trying to jump on that football like you did in Neyland Stadium a couple of years ago. Like the no offense to him, but the boneheaded, what are you doing type of
Yep.
mistake. You can't have any of those in this type of environment too.
Yeah, and that game was kind of a collection of blunders for that Alabama team. I mean, just all the penalties, that play by Quindarius Robinson, and you still only lose on the last second field goal. So it's just that just kind of shows how good Alabama was with Bryce Young on offense, the way he was able to keep that team in that game, because Tennessee kind of had their way with the Alabama defense in that matchup. But yes, this game is going to be, it's going to come down to me of which quarterback plays the best. I really believe that. And I know it's easy to say that. It's almost cliche to say that, but I just feel like with Milroe's experience, I think that you and his ability to not only beat you through the air, but to make plays in the running game. I think if you're Alabama, you have to have some confidence going in this game behind your now veteran quarterback compared to Tennessee, who's what's this will be his seventh, eighth start of his career for
Yes.
Nico. So because he started the ball game, didn't he?
Yes.
So his seventh start, eighth start, excuse me. Milroe has played a lot of football now. He's played in the SEC championship game. He's played in the college football semifinal game. Milroe's whole career is kind of built up for this type of game where, hey, you're going on the road, your team's kind of struggling. We need you to be at your best. Are you ready for that moment? And I think it's an opportunity for Milroe to prove that he is. I think he is ready for the moment, and I think it could be the difference on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're talking about Tennessee's defense being so good and their offense hadn't been as good. A lot of times we talk about like when your offense is super high powered, is scoring all the time, you're running up tempo, you're barely taking any time off the clock. Very rarely do you get that style of offense that can do that, and you're getting really strong defensive play. So you
Yep.
talk about how good Tennessee's been defensively, but it's really game script kind of dictates some of that. You're not stepping out there. Your offense isn't scoring a lot of points, and that kind of is impacting how they're playing them offensively. My point is that you have to be able to understand that this Tennessee defense, while it is really good, and you got to give it a ton of respect, it is very much improved. The fact that it is going to be in Knoxville, that is a big advantage for Tennessee going in.
Yes.
Period. You've got to figure out ways to work around it. And I will say this: James Pearce is one of the best defensive players in all of college football. And if you want me to make a comparison, I'm not saying he is Will Anderson, but when you look at like the numbers and the fact that he hadn't made as big of an impact as like, a lot of people thought that he would, being in the talk for being the number one overall pick in the draft. If you remember, after Will Anderson's just absurd year, everybody was talking about him potentially being the number one overall pick. And he's been one of the best defensive players we've seen in years and all this stuff. And that next year, he was still effective. I think he ended up getting to 10 sacks. He was still very disruptive from a pressure standpoint, but he was not the same player from a production standpoint that he was the year before. A lot of that had to do with teams were saying Will Anderson's not going to beat us. A lot of teams, they're trying to do whatever they can to prevent James Pearce from beating them. And so he's
Yep.
still a really good player, and that's somebody that Alabama has to scheme around. Don't think because he's not being overly productive, relative to expectations, that means, oh, he's just not playing as good, even though I don't think that he necessarily is. It's also he's the focal point going into weeks. Don't let this cat beat you. And out of his roughly about 200 snaps, like 120 of them, I believe, have come off the left side. He's going to play both off on the right and the left. So if it's the defense's left side, that means it's Alabama's right side. So Elijah Pritchett is probably going to be the one seeing James Pearce Jr. the most. He's got to bring his A game. You've got to give him maybe a little bit of help. Running back, tight end, whatever you need to do, maybe do some things to kind of take Pearce out of it. Zone reads where you're reading him. Do whatever you can as far as taking him out of the play, not letting him make an impact. I think that's absolutely huge too. Stacey, do you have anything else before we hop out of here?
Well, I'll say this about Pierce. Don't let his stats fool you this year. This dude is still a really good player. I mean, he's impacting the game in different ways. Like last week, they don't beat Florida without his fumble forced fumble and fumble recovery against Graham Mertz at the goal line.
Yes,
They don't
absolutely.
win that game without Pearce making that play. And he caused the fumble and he recovered the fumble. So that he's making an impact on the game, regardless of what the stat sheets say. I think he's got like 2.5 sacks maybe on the year. So not the numbers that you would expect from a guy who's, one of the best pass rushers in the country. But you mentioned Elijah Pritchett having to play well. He's got to play well. The communication up front, which goes back to the hostile environment, is going to be critical in this game. If they can get that part right, if you're Alabama, I mean, mano a mano, Alabama got dudes too. Even Elijah Pritchett he's turning into a good player. He's not obviously he's going to win some against James Pearce, and James Pearce is probably going to win some against him. But man on man, I like what Alabama has up front, especially at tackle. Caden Proctor's been really, really good this year. But the communication up front, you can't let a free rusher go by like they did a couple times last week against South Carolina. That is what will get you beat on the road against a defense like Tennessee, who is going to be very opportunistic. They're going to be flying around the football. But I'm looking forward to this matchup. I think it's intriguing for, obviously, it's a great rivalry. Josh Heupel versus Kalen DeBoer, two offensive minds, two programs who are looking to kind of find their way this season with a lot of football left to be played. And it starts on Saturday in Knoxville with both teams trying to make a statement that, hey, the second half of this season, we're going to get this turned around, and we're going to be a team to be reckoned with when the college football postseason comes around.
100%. And, you're a couple of years ago when Alabama played LSU in Baton Rouge and Harold Perkins went completely off, and BJ Ojulari did as well. I think they combined for like 15 pressures and a couple of sacks. JC Latham got his butt whipped.
Yeah.
And he was a damn good right tackle for Alabama. He's a really good left tackle for the Tennessee Titans as a rookie. So, I mean, even if you're getting beat sometimes, and even sometimes when it looks ugly, like that doesn't mean I really think Elijah Pritchett is starting to become a pretty darn good player.
I do too.
So, I mean, I understand it, as long as he's continuing to give up plays like he did against Vanderbilt, fans are going to continue to criticize and they're going to hate his guts or whatever. But, sometimes that happens. Good players make good plays. And I don't think that Vanderbilt player was anything to write home about, but I know James Pearce is. So if you see anything like that, I'm not saying be okay with Elijah Pritchett in the moment. That's tough to do, but just understand he's got a tough job. And Caden Proctor will too. I mean, 40% of those snaps are still coming on the other side. So he's not going to be the only one. And Tennessee's got more dudes than just James Pearce. But that's the one that you're going to talk about first and foremost, just like Alabama, would first and foremost talk about, Will Anderson Jr. That's right. Part of it. But Stacey, I appreciate you. I feel like this has been a really good conversation. I hope people have gotten something out of it and enjoyed it. Couple of things just for any of the listeners. First of all, we appreciate you guys so much. Y'all are such a big part of what we do. This thing's growing. I think we're about to cross over 5,000 subscribers. We continue to grow each and every day. We appreciate that. I know Mick does, and me and Stacey and everybody else. Like this video, but go subscribe to the YouTube channel and turn on the notification bell where anytime we're posting new content, you can immediately see it. That will certainly help us, and we would appreciate that very much. But also, we are continuing to grow the message board over at covercrimson.com. We've got some really cool stuff in the works. We're going to be revamping some things, and I think that's really just the aesthetics of it and all that. It's going to be amazing. We're working with a company right now that's kind of helping us out with that. It's going to be the place you want to be. We're also working on potentially anybody who got in on like the ground floor. We're going to have different badges for people. It's kind of the plan right now. Kind of an OG badge is going to be anybody that signed up and is a part of the community during this, building time. We want you to forever be known as one of the people that jumped in on the ground floor with us. And so you're going to have a badge that when people come along later and this thing continues to grow, no one else is going to have it. And that's going to be really cool. And so, that's not come out yet, but it's going to be. But we got a lot of content, and just the game threads are always incredible. I love going back and forth with people. A lot of very informative posters already over there at Cover Crimson. Stacey does a phenomenal job. Mick will jump in and he'll contribute and share his thoughts. And I always love, seeing what he's got to say. Emily Grace will certainly throw in some conversation stuff as well. I do my snap count observations over there. I'm going to be doing some players to watch. this week between Alabama and Tennessee. So if you haven't already, go sign up for that. It's only $1 for the first month, or if you do the annual subscription, you'll get a wicked awesome Cover Crimson t-shirt. And that $1 for a month, we're doing that for the time being because it's new, but that's about to go away and go away soon. In fact, I'm trying to talk them into giving us one more week after this week, but there's no guarantee that it even will be that. So it could be gone as soon as Sunday. So definitely go subscribe right now or sign up. And if you have any trouble signing up, the process right now is a little bit difficult. Like you got to sign up and it asks for like your email and you create the account for free and then you go in. And so like if you have any trouble, reach out to me. I'll have no problem helping you out. Would love to help you. But we just appreciate everybody being a part of this and the YouTube channel as well. So Stacey, once again, I appreciate you, buddy, and we will do this again soon.